Welcome to the search for meaning in these difficult times here on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called The Veneer of Civilization is Paper Thin. The world is under no obligation to make sense. Our co-host for the show is Chang Wang. Welcome to the show, Chang.
Thank you, Jay. Good to see you.
Progress is not a law of nature. It is a temporary suspension of barbarism. When fear rises, institutions weaken, and identities harden. Cruelty returns quickly, not slowly. This episode leaves listeners with an unsettling but necessary lesson. Never overestimate human nature. Never underestimate the speed of evil and how it develops. What demands explanation is not destruction, but decency. That's the important word here, and how fragile the line truly is. So, Chang, you've been thinking about that. You've been thinking about that since your father died and trying to get a philosophical handle on how we deal with all these problems that we see in the world today. They remind us of times gone by. They remind us of times in the 20th century when there was only Schadenfreude. And I'd like to know your current thinking about it and what drives you to want to discuss this.
Well, Jay, recently, and particularly in Minnesota, we hear these comments from our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, that everything messed up, nothing makes sense anymore. The world seems upside down. The value system completely distorted. Well, I quote my former colleague, who was my mentor. He always commented when something happened in the business, is nothing surprised me anymore. And nothing can surprise me anymore because why we are surprised? We should be surprised that the world maintained peaceful and suspended brutality or barbarism for a few decades. And then we're returning to normal. Look at the entire human history for thousand years. And how many years we don't have mass slaughter, war, and brutality. And that was always the case. And then because we have very short memory, we quickly forget it. And so we thought for the past few decades, surprisingly, human race has this collective humanity, collective illusion of progress and development. So no world war since World War II, and there was just sporadic regional war, and most people, a lot of people, or the majority of the world population can fed themselves, even get into diabetic or because of overfeeding, I guess. So at the end of the day, and we should, as you stated at the very beginning of this program. So what do you think, Jay? Do you think the world is upside down? Because you are older than me, and I can't say for sure when you grew up what was the value system, and in when you were a teenager in your neighborhood or in your community. I remember in my teenager years, I was a high school student in Beijing, and 1980s China was extremely pro-American. Everybody tried to learn English language. Everybody watched, American sitcom, and probably I'm not sure you ever heard of that. The Growing Pain. That was a sitcom. Was extremely American sitcom, extremely popular. In all walks of life, among all walks of life in China. So, long story short, you know, the value system I grew up with was the West is right, democracy is right, and freedom is right, pursuit of liberty is right. And suddenly everything shut up. And at the end of the 1980s, you remember what happened in late 1989. And then I was shocked. I was surprised I even thought that bet with my classmate that this is not sustainable. The suppression, distorted reality, outright lie, they are wrong. They are simply wrong according to my value system. So everything will be changed in 5 years. So that was my true belief. However, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, nothing changed. The brutality, the wrongdoing become normalized. People began to accept lie is the truth, war is peace, and so black is white, and in Chinese idiom, the deer is horse, and if the king said the deer is horse, everybody will follow. The deer is a horse, and so now I began to read philosophy, a lot of philosophy and Buddhist text, and I was a big fan of history. And then I look at the what I have learned. I said I shouldn't be surprised. I was wrong to thought that things could change, brutality and the lies could be normalized. Now I accept they have been normalized in entire human history for 1,000 years. And what was were you surprised and when the world doesn't fit in our own value system or the grand narrative?
The answer for me personally was no, I was not surprised. And I'll tell you what I grew up with. And to answer your question, my family always said, be thankful you were born in the United States. This is the best country in the world. And they pointed to the great generation in World War II. They pointed to the American success in the war and after the war. And everyone had the idea that economically things would only get better, health-wise, community-wise, civil society-wise, it would only get better. And there were indications of that. But I said to myself, this is not consistent with my understanding of history. And I was a teenager when this thought came to me. Um, it's not consistent with my study of history. I went to college, and there was a fair amount of information being fed to me that suggested that we can't, just as you say, we can't be sure. Progress is not a law of nature. There is no guarantee that things will always get better. And so I developed this kind of skepticism, under the hood skepticism, to say, gee whiz, I'm not sure about this. Everybody around me seems to think that this is this is the norm and things will always get better. Every generation will be better off than the last one. But I always wondered if that was true. And I also wondered what would happen if 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 it did not happen, if it did not take place. What would be the human condition? And this kind of skepticism, this questioning for me, went right through college and, for that matter, law school. I said, it's a wonderful thing that we have this society, but will it last? Can it last? There's so many indications that it won't last. And now we get into more recent times, and I say to myself, I'm getting my answer. I'm getting the answer to the question of what happens if it doesn't last. So my skepticism was justified looking back, and the question is being answered looking forward, looking now. That is, where do you go? What happens around you if your optimism is not the norm? But I want to ask you this question, Chang.
Mhm.
We seem to be better off. You're probably eating better than your family did in China years ago. And certainly my family, all parts of my family is eating better. And we have prospects and we are middle class. And so we are happy enough with our lives. But we can clearly see that a lot of people are not as lucky as fortunate as we are. Now, you can say that we're better off than people were in the 14th century. And indeed, we don't have to cope with the Black Plague. So there's this notion that although you may have a terrible time at a given point in history, each generation somehow, even after calamities, disasters, and the Black Plague comes your way, you're still better off. As some people say, the price of peace is war. The price of peace is violence. So the people in the 20th century died, but that taught everybody else how important it was not to have war. But is that lesson sustainable? Does that lesson go on for the next generation and the generation after that? Right now, even in Germany, there's the AfD. These guys adhere to Nazism. You say maybe they forgot, maybe they never knew, maybe they're returning to some cultural hang-up about violence and Schadenfreude. And so I still question whether the species is going to be doing better. That sine curve, of war and then peace and then war and then peace, that sine curve affects the entire species or just the survivors of the war. Your thoughts?
It's very complicated question. I'm not sure I'm competent to answer, but I do have two comments, if I may. One is yes, as Steven Pinker said, the human condition improved dramatically for the past few centuries, and we should be all optimist. And because less people suffering, less people less hunger, and a child mortality rate and is way low. And because of vaccine, that the pandemic is less frequent. All of that. However, what perspective we have? What perspective we have is from the human race. And forgive me, but I believe that all animals are equal, and I do not believe some animals are equal than others. And what look at all the animals what we tortured, we slaughtered every day, millions of them, billions of them. And I believe that there was a famous quote that to every single animal in the world, every single human being is a Nazi. And the hidden price, the hidden cost of we can have protein every day is we slaughtered millions other animals, which they have emotion, they feel pain and suffering, and they are living in hell. So the end of the first comment is if we feel that the world doesn't make any sense, how do you explain what is the sense an animal can feel and a cow, a chicken, a pig being fed for a few weeks, few months, then got completely slaughtered and cut into pieces and sell it at the grocery store. So I think that the 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 argument that human make collective progress is pretty one-sided. Is there's a very high hidden cost of this so-called progress. The second comment that are we going to completely forget the concept, the collective goodness we have built for the past few decades, and where all this chaos and turmoil is going. And that remind me two uh, historical, events. One is Army McCarthy hearing. We all know, I think you taught me about the Army McCarthy hearing, and my law professors also repeated this story, and to show the courage in the time of insanity. So when the all-powerful McCarthy bullying, intimidating people in the U.S. Senate, Joseph Welch stood up and asked him, Have you no decency, sir? Have you no sense of decency, sir? That was the moment of emperor have no clothes moment, and and that was the begin of downfall of the all-powerful McCarthy. So when I first read this story in the history books, I was shocked. I said, how dare Welch could do that? Could, didn't he, fear consequences? It could be blacklisted, disbarred, even not only bullied, but have real consequences professionally and in real life. Then I read a book. I'm going to quote this book to you. Many years later, I read this book and I found that I got my answer. Why Joseph Welch could stand up against the bully. That book was written by two psychologists called The Person and the Situation. It's a long quote, but please bear with me. When we are confronted with behavior that seems to suggest exceptional personal attributes of any kind, we tell ourselves to pause and consider the situation. What were the details of the immediate context of the behavior? How was the situation construed by the actor? And what was the broader social context or social system within which the actors were functioning? So that is one side. And I'm going to change it to a second example. Is Stanford Prison Experiment. So in Stanford Prison Experiment is also about context. I want make a note of a context here. So the context is the answer to explain good behavior in our view. And Joseph Welch seemed extraordinary courage and behavior in the U.S. Senate. And then we're going to turn to the opposite side. In 71, Stanford University professor Philip Zimbardo conducted this experiment. So he recruited about a dozen students, young students, and randomly assigned them into different roles, two groups. One group is prison guards, the second group is prisoners. And the entire experiment supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down in 5 days, I believe, or 6 days, because people, if the experiment continues and somebody would die. And all these recruits, all these students, they were mentally capable, no medical issue problem, no criminal history, no violent tendency, nothing. And they were just ordinary young people. And so, but when they played, after just a few days, the group placed prison guards began to torture and brutalize, humiliating, abusing, and tormenting the prisoners. And the prisoners, the the student played prisoners seemingly to accept that is that are their roles. They began to be mentally unstable, deprivation of sleep, tormenting, and then quickly slide into depression. And they are collapsing. The students are collapsing both mentally and physically. So, and the professor shut down the experiment and said, "We can't continue." And people were shocked, become a very controversial experiment, not only in the 70s, but today. So, how come seemingly normal people did extraordinary bad things just in a matter of few days? And then the professor gave an answer: context. It's all about context. In a context of dehumanization, like in the fake prison, in a context of de-individualization, and in the context of nameless, people do what they are best to do: brutality, barbarity, medieval level barbarity. So we should be surprised to witness the barbarity, the cruelty, the terrorism we witness nowadays in the news. because that is not only human nature, but the human nature normally in our peaceful time being suppressed or hidden under a very thin veneer of civilization. And if you provide the right context, and all of them will resurface, will show up. This is the real face of human nature. And also go back to Joseph Welch story. The Joseph Welch was a normal lawyer, was a decent lawyer. He was not a hero, but because of the context, gave him the license to be courageous. By the same, you know, reason, now the terrorist, now the brutal brutality we witnessed, because they have license. And the key, last but not least, the key, according to the Stanford professor, is mask. Mask. If you become anonymous, your real human nature and play the key role. That's why perhaps on the internet and people appear to be mean, and in real life, people at least play nice or pretend to be play nice. But on the internet, if you have a nickname or a night name of something, you know uh, I just make this up, John 45, something. You are anonymous, and you become very mean and brutal and to other people. So that's my very long comments or footnotes to your extremely sophisticated and difficult question.
Well, we're really raising some important issues here. I'm familiar with those experiments, and the Stanford, it was only one of them. There were a number of others in the same period of time. Gene Rosenfeld, who is an independent scholar who appears regularly on one of our other shows, talks about that kind of experiment frequently. And it comes to the conclusion, at least for me, is that nobody is exempt, and that if you put the student or any individual in a silo and give him or her that the context to be brutal, you can make that person brutal. If you isolate that person, if you give that person certain signals and diminish other signals, you can make that person send an electric shock. This is part of those experiments
Oh,
to a victim, even to the point of hurting or killing the victim. An ordinary person, a person who was decent before and loses the decency. It is built into the DNA, I think. And so that's what
absolutely.
happened, for example, in Germany. You mentioned offline an Auschwitz survivor in an interview by Anderson Cooper, who said the Nazis who were in Germany were not necessarily strangers. They were ordinary people, neighbors, and they knew at some level of awareness that it was their neighbors who were being killed in the camps. And this is Schadenfreude. So, and I'm thinking that conditions, at some level, in some context, as you say, still exists and will always exist among the species. And let me add one other thought that comes to mind while you were talking, and that is this: if I go on Netflix or Prime and look at a movie, the likelihood, if not the majority of movies, involve brutality, involve
Hmm.
violence and vengeance and killing and weapons, either on an individual level or on a mass destruction level. And people tune into that. And Hollywood creates movies knowing that people will tune into that. It sells. All of that violence and vengeance sell. So I guess the question for me is, why does it sell? Romantic movies are there too, but they're not as popular, it seems, just by virtue of the number of movies that are available, not as popular as the violence and vengeance. And I think it feeds off the same human attribute. So there we have it. And at the end of the day, we have got to address that. We have got to, I don't know if the word cure is the right word, but we've got to face up to it, and we've got to stop doing that because it's not the aspirational best for the species. So I think we have lots of proof in our hands that not only the Stanford experiment, which I think is very probative, but many other examples of how people devolved into virtual monsters, perfectly willing to kill and torture strangers. And I think that kind of thing is what's at play now in this country, under the Trump administration, where people are rising up, and that kind of intuition, that kind of attribute is being exploited by people who don't like democracy, who don't particularly ascribe to decency, and who are very happy with hurting, killing, torturing, other people. So we really have to get past that. And unfortunately, I think we are seeing it. See if you agree with me. We are seeing it emerge in the world today. We are seeing living daily proof of this human attribute. Do you agree?
I can kind of agree, but again, as I said, I'm not surprised. And I want to quote a few of my favorite authors in history. One was the founding father of Chinese political reform in the late 1900s, and his name was Liang Qichao, and who started political reform but failed. And he said, look at the entire Chinese history, 24 of them. There was 2,000 years, dynasty after dynasty, and there were 24 official history book of those 24 dynasties. And this scholar said the entire 24 histories was nothing but books of slaughter, people slaughtering each other, people killing each other for 1,000 years. And the father of modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun, said in one of his very famous novel, The Madman's Diary, and he said the entire history book and is filled with one word. The entire history book was filled with one word: eating people. Cannibalism. And the entire Chinese history, all the world history, is people slaughtering each other or kill each other. And Shakespeare said, "The hell is empty, and all the devils are here." And finally, Balzac said, "To inflict suffering upon anything capable of suffering is human nature." So, but I do want to put into the context. The context is banality of evil, like the philosopher Hannah Arendt said after the World War II. She in her essay or the book Eichmann in Jerusalem, is that guy, that murderer, that butcher, just look like a normal people, look like an accountant. You could say that could play an accountant in a Hollywood movie. It's so boring. It's nothing surprising. It's the brutality. Terrorism doesn't require sadists to do it. Just need normal people with the right context. In Nazi Germany, the Nazi officer like Achman, and they burn Jewish people. They burn Jews, and they return home, take a shower, change clothes, have very peaceful and nice dinner with their family, and then his friends showed up. They're gonna play Bach. They're gonna play chamber music, and completely separated from what he did during the day. Did he realize he was evil? Absolutely not. He was just doing his job. And look at terrorists. And they burn people, they bomb people, they kill people on the street. They put on a mask, then they return home. And they open a cold beer and they watch TV. And they didn't think there's nothing inconsistent in their behavior by brutalizing and killing other people, shout people in their face, then return home and watch TV. And so because they are in the context, they are in that context normalizing this kind of behavior. They have the context telling you we versus them. Okay, they are others. They are not as worthy as you. They are not real human beings. They are immigrants. They are trans people, and they are, maybe Chinese, Japanese during World War II. They're Italian or Irish. If we go back to history, American history for a few, century, 2 centuries. So this dichotomy, all this differentiation, really gave people context and give people a license to do what they did. So there's nothing we really surprise it, because the progress, as you mentioned, I think the progress and the world peace, the globalization after World War II was an abnormality in human history. Was an abnormality. Was not normal in human history. And nowadays, we either accept the fact that the grand narrative we told ourselves, all the human nature are fundamentally good, people longing for war, for peace, stability, and a collective happiness. All we accept this grand narrative is just a story. We told ourselves to make sense of the world. As I quote last time, Neil deGrasse Tyson said, uh, "The universe is under no obligation to make sense to us." And you also mentioned that at the beginning of our show, by the same reason, the world that is not under any obligation to make sense to us. To make sense to us, we try to make sense of the world. We try to make sense of the universe. That's why we invented the narrative of constitution, the collective happiness, the representative democracy, the due process, and the equal protection, and to make sense of the world. And just like we invented the concept of time to make sense of the universe. The universe knows nothing about time. The universe have zero interest in and to have a structure called the time we invented for ourselves to understand the universe. By the same reason, the society, the entire world, have zero interest in our narrative or our story. We told ourselves constitution prevails, liberal democracy prevails.
A lot of this, Chang, is got to do with history, with the understanding of history. And YouTube has helped me. I minored in history in college, which leads me to some of my thought on this. But people forget, and history, the study of history, is so important to provide the context you're talking about. Now, for example, all these battles that we talk about that happened in Europe. I mean, I think that's part of the American educational system, focusing on the battles in Europe. Those battles were really brutal. Talk about barbarism. Europe was a study in barbarism. All these countries that are now ostensibly at peace, they were killing each other with horrendous barbarism. But then time goes by. You talk about time goes by, and we collectively, we forget. And we forget the barbarism. And so we repeat it. What's the old George Santayana saying? He who forgets history is doomed to repeat it. He who forgets the barbarism is doomed to repeat it, because history is punctuated with barbarism. But I want to ask you one final question. I think is very important. Talk about the greatest generation, talk about war, talk about people who are really fed up with war, and they've lost family, they've lost friends, and they say to themselves, gee, we can't do that again. That's too painful, because they're close in time to those events, and they have the detail. It's not 500 years ago, it's maybe 5 years ago. So what you have then is a collective desire not to do that again. And that, I think, I suggest to you, that takes leadership, because as time goes by, you need leadership to remind us, that we don't live like Lord of the Flies, that we have to come together and be collectively decent and respectful of other members of the species. And so I guess my question is, what do we do going forward? Do we seek out, can we find leaders who will remind us of this sine curve, who will remind us that we must keep in mind the notion of decency, or else we will be doomed to repeat the barbarism? How do we find those leaders? How do we elevate those leaders?
That's an extremely tough question, Jay. Let me quickly respond to your quote. Then I will try to answer your question. Your quote is the people who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And there's a second part of that quote. The second part is the people who study history, like you, are doomed helplessly looking at other people repeating it. So so that's my comment on to your quote. And now I'm definitely not qualified to answer this question where we find inspirational leaders to lead us out of this collective madness. I think that my answer will be slightly different angle. My angle is how, if in the best case scenario, can we have a commonly accepted reality by the majority of the population? Because obviously, half country live in one reality, half country live in another reality. That's the I think that is the biggest problem. You can have a leader from both different realities, and they are competing. The reality is completely competing. If we remember Japanese filmmaker Kurosawa's very famous film Rashomon, which means that four witnesses witnessing exactly the same killing, and they have completely different stories to tell. And what exactly happened in front of their eyes are completely different. That might have a psychology or philosophical answer, analysis or explanation for that, because the reality is our self-construct. If you self-construct a reality which is jungle and people killing each other, your reality is that jungle. And if you are people like the good and pretty, and you believe that human nature are fundamentally good, we should help each other, and we should try to, you know, avoid conflict and to improve other people's well-being and reduce other people's pain and suffering, you live in a better world. So the key is, how can we reconcile these two completely opposite reality? Yes, and that, I think that is the first question we answer, and before we even get into any deeper regarding politics. So I'm not hopeful and that we can have a shared reality. We have a very brief shared reality after World War II, probably 10 years or 20 years. And then reality divided among different tribes. And people began to go back to their tribal mentality, and people in power, they feel extreme victimhood, and they feel that they've been discriminated against. And then there's other people, they have total different narrative to tell. So again, context and the reality, that's also the biggest problem I think we are facing.
Wow, important stuff. We need to explore this going forward. We need to take little pieces of it and try to expand on those pieces and see how they play, not only in the appreciation of history, but in the appreciation of things that will allow us to come together, to associate again, to find civil society again. Anyway, I think we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much, Chang Wang, our co-host. I'm Jay Fidell, host of the Search for Meaning in These Very Difficult Times. In this episode, which we are calling The Veneer of Civilization is Paper Thin. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha, Chang.
Aloha, Jay.